people change when they are ready, not when you plead. They change when their own habits begin to weigh on them, not when their actions hurt only those around them. Yet so often, we find ourselves holding on, waiting, hoping, shaping our lives around someone else's timeline. Stoicism reminds us that reality is indifferent. What we cannot control is not ours to fix. What we can govern is our response, the calm we maintain, and the integrity with which we navigate each moment. It can be painful to realize that caring deeply does not grant control. The temptation to cling to what could be, to imagine someone as we wish them to be, is strong. Wisdom calls us to observe what is, without projection or self-deception. True clarity comes when we confront patterns as they exist, and in that clarity lies freedom, the ability to act with intention, define boundaries, and honor ourselves without resentment. It is here, in the quiet recognition of what is, that strength arises. A steady mind, aware and deliberate, finds its power not in shaping others, but in maintaining its own equilibrium. Each choice made with reason and reflection reinforces the life we wish to live, grounded in reality, guided by virtue, and aligned with our values. Think about the patterns you've observed, not the words spoken, not the fleeting promises, but the actions that repeat quietly, without fanfare. We are drawn to speech, to assurances offered in warmth and optimism, yet those moments drift like smoke. What endures is behavior. What repeats without observation is the true reflection of character. Notice the small gestures that go unseen, the choices made when convenience or comfort is absent. These reveal priorities, the invisible architecture of intention meeting reality. Stoicism teaches that action outweighs rhetoric. In patterns lies the measure of who someone truly is. Repetition uncovers values more reliably than speech ever can. Consistency shows where energy is invested, what is protected, and what is left to chance. Patterns emerge subtly, the missed calls, the unkept promises, the excuses for repeated lapses. Alone, they may seem minor. Over time, however, they form a tapestry revealing the core of character. It is tempting to rationalize, to excuse, to attribute lapses to stress or circumstance. But repeated choices cannot be ignored. They show whether someone sustains or erodes your sense of stability and peace. Hope often masks reality. We imagine potential as a bridge to what could be and invest energy in visions that may never materialize. When we invest in the potential of others, imagination can overshadow observation. It is easy to mistake what we wish for as evidence of progress, to measure unfolding character by what we hope exists. Stoicism reminds us that reality is indifferent to desire. Aligning judgment with what is, rather than what we wish it to be, preserves clarity and integrity. Recognizing patterns requires deliberate attention, a disciplined observation that protects your inner life. Each repeated act is data for the mind to interpret. Noticing these rhythms allows insight into relationships and the consequences of continued investment. Tolerating inconsistency because of attachment is a subtle surrender of one's own well-being. Over time, repeated exposure to unreliability erodes confidence, heightens emotional strain, and normalizes compromises that once would have been unacceptable. Observation without distortion reclaims discernment, situating us in reason rather than reaction. Patterns also reveal the limits of influence. No amount of pleading or persuasion can produce virtues not chosen internally. When behavior resists change, hope alone cannot accelerate growth. Marcus Aurelius taught that wisdom consists in perceiving what is within our control and what is not. The actions of others fall outside the latter. Effort spent attempting to compel change may be wasted, and recognizing this allows one to preserve mental and emotional balance. Seeing reality as it is, rather than how we wish it to be, is not pessimism. It is preparation for deliberate action. The temptation to intervene often arises from seeing potential that is unrealized. We imagine someone as they could be, not as they are. When we act to shape outcomes based on projection, we prioritize our comfort over their autonomy. Stoicism reminds us that perception must align with reality. Actions taken without consent do not cultivate virtue. They impose control, which may generate resistance, resentment, or dependence. Influence is exercised through example, environment, and integrity, not through coercion or insistence. True growth occurs when internal recognition aligns with deliberate choice. Responsibility lies in preserving one's own integrity. By focusing on internal consistency, moral alignment, and clarity of judgment, we maintain agency and composure. Our role is not to dictate trajectories, but to embody values, cultivate stability, and create an environment conducive to virtue. Attempting to control choices beyond our authority undermines peace. Observing boundaries, offering support, and honoring autonomy preserves both integrity and equilibrium. Ultimately, the measure of wisdom lies in aligning energy with what is within our influence. By observing patterns, distinguishing hope from evidence, and preserving self-respect, we reclaim agency. Patience, reflection, and careful observation allow us to engage intentionally, maintaining composure in the face of uncertainty. By prioritizing action rooted in principle rather than reaction, by honoring our own boundaries while respecting the autonomy of others, we navigate relationships with clarity, equanimity, and integrity. Influence is effective only when aligned with reason, not expectation. If these reflections resonate, subscribing is a choice to practice calm observation, strengthen your mind, and live deliberately. Let it be a step toward engaging with life through reason, clarity, and quiet self-mastery. Here, growth is intentional, disciplined, and profoundly your own. It is easy to justify waiting, to rationalize, to accommodate. Each hope-filled day feels like an investment in eventual alignment, a promise of resolution that sustains patience. But each pattern unaltered is a silent message, repeated consistently, about priorities, values, and capacity for growth. The careful observer learns to differentiate between temporary lapses and entrenched behaviors, understanding that patience has limits and that discernment is exercised by attending to repetition over rhetoric. This understanding transforms engagement with others. By centering attention on observable patterns, we are able to measure not only their character, but also the impact of their behaviors on our own lives. Choices become clearer. Decisions about presence, investment, and boundaries are guided by evidence rather than hope. Stoic practice encourages this orientation, to respond to what is within sight, to act with integrity, and to cultivate internal stability regardless of external inconsistency. The awareness that change must arise from internal willingness, not external insistence, allows for self-respect to remain intact even when external expectations are unmet. The subtle power of observing patterns lies in its cumulative effect. It allows clarity to emerge where confusion once prevailed, wisdom to settle where hope and projection once dominated. The recognition of repeated behaviors equips the mind to act decisively, to choose engagement or disengagement based on reality rather than desire. The consistent observation of action over words preserves not only understanding but also peace of mind, allowing for thoughtful, measured decisions about who is welcomed, tolerated, or released from the inner sphere of influence. By anchoring judgment in reality, the clarity required to maintain integrity and well-being becomes achievable, and the freedom to act in alignment with one's values becomes tangible. Consider why you cling, not to someone's words, not to the fleeting moments when everything seems aligned, but to the idea that their change or growth will somehow fill a void inside you. There is a subtle, often invisible tension in this desire, a quiet ache that stems from an unrecognized need within. When we attempt to shape someone else, we often do it unconsciously, believing that helping, guiding, or molding them will soothe the emptiness we carry. The irony is that the very act of trying to control or accelerate another's development can diminish our own vitality. Stoicism reminds us that what lies within our power is not the behavior of others, but the clarity and integrity with which we navigate our own lives. The recognition of this truth is a subtle awakening, a shift from hope-based investment to observation-based discernment. The desire for connection is primal. It drives us to endure, to rationalize, to forgive over and over again. Yet in this drive, the boundary between self-preservation and self-erasure often blurs. We crave acknowledgement, approval, or validation, and in doing so, we surrender pieces of ourselves, each small compromise accumulating until our inner landscape is transformed into something unrecognizable. The Stoics teach that tranquility is maintained by understanding what is within our control and what is not. Our attention, our effort, our moral choices, these are ours. The choices of others, their willingness to grow, change, or respond, are external. By focusing on what is within reach, we reclaim the space that fear and longing have quietly occupied. Reflection becomes essential. Ask yourself what drives your attachment. Is it genuine concern for the other, or is it the quiet hope that their change will bring comfort, fill gaps, or affirm your significance? Often, these motives are entwined, and disentangling them requires honesty and courage. The truth is more demanding. The work begins within, with awareness, discipline, and the willingness to observe patterns as they exist, uncolored by imagination. Once the patterns are clear, the question becomes endurance. How long are you willing to tolerate behaviors that misalign with your values, diminish your clarity, or erode your sense of self? It is not a question to answer lightly, because the cost of prolonged tolerance is often invisible until it has already exacted its toll. Each compromise, each rationalization, each moment of silent accommodation chips away at your center, subtly shifting your perception of what is acceptable. The Stoic approach is to measure endurance carefully, to distinguish between patience rooted in principle and patience rooted in fear or avoidance. True self-mastery involves recognizing the difference between the two and acting accordingly. Love and fear are frequently entangled. It is easy to interpret attachment as love when, in fact, it is fear in disguise. The fear of solitude, the fear of being wrong, the fear of confronting loss. These fears manifest in behaviors that sustain relationships, commitments, and hopes that may not serve your well-being. Marcus Aurelius observed that reason and self-examination illuminate what is within our control and what is not. By cultivating self-awareness, we gain the tools to identify when attachment is rooted in virtue and care, and when it is rooted in anxiety or insecurity. Clarity arises in this practice, allowing the mind to act with intention rather than reflex. The act of discerning whether to remain is also an exercise in integrity. When faced with repeated behaviors that misalign with our values, we must examine our motivation for staying. Are we choosing presence because of genuine care, or because the discomfort of departure seems unbearable? Are we sustaining engagement because of hope rooted in imagination, or because we have accepted the invisible cost of inaction? The clarity to distinguish between what nourishes and what diminishes is a skill cultivated through deliberate reflection, not emotional impulse. Finally, consider the freedom inherent in choice. To recognize the motivations that sustain attachment is to regain agency. The awareness that clinging is often a response to internal need rather than the actual needs of the other person allows one to act with autonomy. Boundaries can be established with calm and reason, decisions made with measured intention. By observing why attachment persists, by examining the desires and fears that underlie it, and by measuring endurance against principle rather than hope, the mind begins to reclaim clarity. The awareness of self-responsibility is both liberating and grounding, revealing that love, care, and patience are most effective when aligned with reality, not illusion. Through this lens, attachment transforms from a passive response into an active practice of discernment. It is no longer a matter of surrendering to hope or anxiety. It becomes a deliberate engagement with reality, an acknowledgement of patterns as they exist, and a thoughtful determination of where investment of time, energy, and care is truly justified. The Stoic perspective teaches that inner equilibrium is preserved when observation guides judgment, when integrity governs response, and when self-respect is treated as paramount. By understanding the sources of clinging and examining the motivations behind attachment, we illuminate the path toward clarity, agency, and wisdom, ensuring that decisions are informed by truth rather than projection, fear, or hope alone. Control is often mistaken for care. The impulse to guide, correct, or shape someone else can feel noble, even loving. It is tempting to believe that if you provide enough direction, if you push, if you persuade, you are helping, protecting, or saving. Yet, when examined honestly, much of this behavior is rooted not in genuine concern for the other person, but in a desire to manage discomfort. Fear is rarely absent. Fear of being abandoned, fear of facing disappointment, fear of the unknown that comes with detachment. The effort to control is a quiet defense mechanism, a way to avoid confronting the reality that some things cannot be steered by desire or insistence. It can masquerade as compassion, yet beneath it often lies the anxiety of the self rather than the care of another. Stoic philosophy reminds us that the only sphere over which we have true authority is the mind, the internal reasoning and judgment that governs our choices and our perception. The thoughts we cultivate, the responses we choose, and the moral framework we observe are within our domain. All else exists externally, indifferent to our wishes, our hopes, or our anxieties. Attempting to reshape another's character without their voluntary engagement is an exercise in futility. It is like trying to alter the course of a river by standing on its banks and pushing water with your hands. The effort expends energy, yet the river flows as it must. Understanding this distinction between what we can influence and what we cannot is central to self-mastery. This is not a rejection of compassion or empathy. True care manifests not in manipulation, but in respect for autonomy. It is visible in listening deeply, offering guidance when invited, and setting boundaries that honor both parties' dignity. When we attempt to mold someone to meet our expectations, it often conceals a subtle, self-protective motive. The desire to avoid the emotional labor of disappointment, the unease of unmet expectations, or the discomfort of letting go. The distinction is crucial. Actions that arise from genuine concern do not seek to impose a narrative. They facilitate growth in ways that honor the other's agency. Actions rooted in control, by contrast, often prioritize the preservation of comfort over integrity or wisdom. Reflection helps illuminate these patterns. Ask yourself why the urge to influence arises. Are you motivated by care for the other or by fear of facing your own vulnerability? Are the actions you take promoting virtue, insight, and self-responsibility, or are they a means of maintaining a sense of security through manipulation? The answers reveal more about your own attachments than about the other person's character. The desire to intervene often arises in response to observed imperfections, repeated mistakes, or habits that conflict with our own values. These observations can provoke strong emotional reactions, frustration, disappointment, irritation, and the mind seeks a way to alleviate the discomfort. One method is to attempt control, to impose change, or to correct behaviors that clash with expectations. Yet, any attempt to impose change without consent risks eroding trust, diminishing autonomy, and creating resistance. The Stoic approach teaches that influence must be indirect, subtle, and grounded in example rather than compulsion. True change occurs when the other's internal recognition, aligns with action, not when external pressure enforces behavior. It is also worth acknowledging that efforts to control often mask a deeper discomfort, the fear of being irrelevant, of being left unneeded, of confronting the uncertainty of the other's choices. The mind craves certainty, and when that certainty is absent, the impulse to manage and mold grows stronger. Carl Jung observed that much of human behavior is governed by unconscious drives, desires, and fears. By bringing these unconscious motivations into awareness, we can recognize when an attempt to influence another arises from internal anxiety rather than authentic care. This awareness allows us to choose actions aligned with integrity rather than reaction, and to preserve equanimity while navigating relationships. The consequences of conflating control with care extend beyond the other person. They shape the internal landscape of the one attempting influence. Repeated efforts to mold behavior can generate frustration, resentment, and emotional fatigue. The energy spent trying to create outcomes outside one's control is energy diverted from self-mastery, clarity, and deliberate action. Recognizing the limits of influence allows one to act with intention, conserve energy, and prioritize choices that are within the realm of agency. Ultimately, the measure of integrity lies in the distinction between action rooted in fear and action rooted in virtue. Actions taken to soothe unease, to preempt disappointment, or to impose a desired outcome upon another reveal attachment to external results. Actions taken to respect autonomy, to model values through personal conduct, and to guide through example reflect care aligned with reason. In relationships, this principle is essential. Recognizing that change can only occur through voluntary acknowledgement and deliberate choice allows for engagement that is wise, compassionate, and sustainable. It is tempting to romanticize the person we wish to be with, to overlay imagination over reality. We are drawn to the aura of what could be, the potential, the charisma, the energy that entertains and inspires. Yet such projections are not reliable guides to the substance of character. What is real, what is enduring, is revealed in how someone responds when there is nothing extraordinary to perform for, when no admiration is to be gained, and when no one is watching. This is where patterns emerge and authenticity is tested. The repeated ordinary behaviors become the measure of consistency, integrity, and alignment with values. They tell a story far more truthful than words or promises ever could. Consider the small, often unnoticed moments that compose everyday life. The willingness to carry out a shared responsibility, the patience shown when stress mounts, the empathy extended in minor conflicts. These are the threads from which the fabric of character is woven. They may not inspire awe in the moment, and they may be invisible to outsiders, but they are the indicators that shape the reality of relationship dynamics. To focus solely on the exceptional is to risk living in an illusion. It is in these ordinary moments that truth pierces projection, revealing whether alignment exists or if admiration is being directed toward a fabricated ideal. The recognition of mundane reality requires disciplined observation. One cannot rely on emotion alone, for hope and desire often cloud judgment. Stoicism instructs that clarity emerges when perception is trained to notice the consistent over the ephemeral. The practices of reflection, attention, and careful evaluation allow one to see whether behaviors cohere with principles and values, rather than with fleeting impressions. Our promises followed by consistent action. Our values upheld even when convenience, fatigue, or distraction intervenes. The answers to these questions illuminate the degree to which connection is grounded in reality, rather than wishful thinking. Ordinary life tests patience and tolerance. It is easy to endure the exhilarating moments, but when monotony, fatigue, and responsibility dominate, the cracks in character become apparent. Small gestures of neglect, inconsistency in support, or failure to uphold commitments may seem trivial individually, but collectively they signal alignment, or the lack of it. Marcus Aurelius emphasized that the measure of virtue is how one responds to what is mundane and inevitable, not what is rare or extraordinary. Observing these patterns without the influence of imagination allows for a grounded understanding of who a person is and what it will mean to engage with them consistently over time. There is also a temptation to excuse behaviors that do not align with expectations because of perceived potential. We rationalize, hoping that shortcomings will be overcome or that the person will rise to meet the ideal we envision. Yet, Seneca warned against substituting hope for evidence, reminding us that our judgments must be rooted in observation rather than aspiration. To continually tolerate misalignment because of projected potential is to sacrifice clarity, self-respect, and the opportunity to respond to reality as it exists. It is in accepting the present moment with discernment that one maintains integrity and exercises reasoned choice. Fatigue, boredom, and responsibility reveal more than any display of charm. The patience exercised in the face of daily repetition, the resilience in minor irritations, the attention given when engagement is unremarkable, these are the demonstrations of character that endure. The quiet acknowledgement of responsibilities, the consistent respect for agreements, and the maintenance of integrity when no one is watching are the foundations of trust and reliability. To ignore these is to elevate performance above substance, appearance above essence. The Stoic perspective prioritizes enduring qualities over transient displays, teaching that reality is found in the habitual, the constant, and the measurable. Ultimately, evaluating reality in the ordinary clarifies expectations, guides engagement, and illuminates boundaries. It allows one to distinguish between the person who aligns with values and intentions and the imagined version we may wish to inhabit alongside them. Epictetus reminded that the measure of wisdom is understanding what is within our control and what is not, and that clarity arises when perception is grounded in observable fact rather than emotional projection. The ordinary, when observed attentively, becomes a mirror reflecting the authenticity of character, revealing where harmony exists and where detachment may be necessary. By focusing on the mundane as the true test of consistency, one cultivates discernment, preserves integrity, and navigates relationships with awareness, patience, and grounded judgment. Am I tolerating what I should not? It is a question that often goes unspoken, buried beneath the weight of habit, hope, or fear. We convince ourselves that patience is virtue, that endurance is a sign of care, that compromise must come at a cost to preserve connection. Yet, when patience stretches beyond reason, it becomes quiet erosion. Each tolerated slight, each overlooked pattern, each repeated disappointment accumulates like water against stone, slowly shaping the contours of our inner life. The challenge lies not in recognizing the harm immediately, but in acknowledging it while it quietly persists, in discerning the moments when accommodation is constructive versus when it undermines self-respect. This is the subtle, often invisible test of judgment, one that requires a calm but unwavering assessment of reality. Radical acceptance is not passive surrender. It does not mean resigning oneself to misery, nor does it condone repeated harm. Instead, it is a deliberate recognition of what is, clear-eyed, unembellished, unflinching. It is the practice of observing reality without the distortions of hope or projection, seeing patterns as they are, rather than as we wish them to be. The Stoics emphasized that clarity comes from acknowledging the nature of circumstances and responding with reasoned action rather than emotional compulsion. To accept what is does not mean tolerating injustice or harm. It means understanding the limits of what can be controlled and exercising judgment about what action is appropriate, sustainable, and aligned with one's values. This distinction is the cornerstone of self-mastery. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as surrender, but it need not come at the expense of well-being. To forgive is to release the emotional burden, to let go of the compulsion to dwell in resentment without relinquishing boundaries or compromising integrity. It is possible to forgive while still choosing distance, to recognize the good in someone while acknowledging the cost of continued engagement, and to act with care for oneself while remaining compassionate toward another. Seneca reminded us that misfortune is often less destructive than the judgments we impose upon it, and that maintaining virtue requires discernment in responding to others. Forgiveness is thus a tool of the mind, a practice of deliberate choice, not a surrender to circumstance. Choosing what is right for oneself often requires confronting uncomfortable truths, the patterns that persist unaltered, the behaviors that repeat despite requests or guidance, demand evaluation. To continue without assessment is to allow external forces to dictate internal peace. Marcus Aurelius noted that life is shaped by judgment, and that wisdom lies in responding thoughtfully rather than reacting instinctively. Each decision to tolerate, endure, or disengage is an exercise of discernment, a measurement of integrity against reality. By observing what is consistently presented rather than what is hoped for, the mind cultivates the clarity necessary to act in alignment with values, safeguarding well-being while maintaining empathy. Tolerance is not synonymous with self-sacrifice. It is not a measure of loyalty, nor is it an indicator of virtue in the absence of reflection. True tolerance is active, deliberate, and informed. It arises from awareness of patterns, from understanding the costs and limits of patience, and from the courage to act when circumstances indicate that continued endurance is harmful. Epictetus emphasized that tranquility is achieved by distinguishing between what is within one's power and what is not, and that wisdom consists in reserving effort for the former. In relationships, this principle is crucial. The choices we make regarding engagement, proximity, and emotional investment define the quality of our inner life more than the behaviors of others. Patterns that persist unaltered are instructive. They reveal priorities, values, and alignment, or misalignment, with our expectations and standards. By observing them without distortion, one can distinguish between what is tolerable and what undermines integrity. To remain blind to repetition or to rationalize it is to erode clarity and self-respect. Stoic practice encourages deliberate attention to evidence, not imagination, and measured responses based on observation rather than hope. Each tolerated action must be weighed against its impact on mental and emotional equilibrium, and each choice must reflect conscious commitment to principles rather than the desire to preserve comfort or avoid confrontation. The courage to act in alignment with discernment is integral to self-mastery. When patterns persist despite notice and reflection, decisive engagement is required. This may involve setting boundaries, withdrawing energy, or re-evaluating involvement in a relationship or dynamic. The aim is not punishment, retribution, or control, but the preservation of reasoned judgment and internal peace. Socrates observed that the unexamined life is a life surrendered to circumstance, and by extension, the unexamined tolerance of persistent patterns is a surrender to external forces. Recognizing when endurance ceases to serve virtue is a subtle but profound act of agency, one that affirms values while navigating complex interpersonal realities. To navigate life with integrity, awareness, and courage is to exercise the principles of Stoicism in daily practice. Each decision to forgive, set boundaries, or withdraw reflects conscious engagement rather than reactionary submission. Each recognition of persistent patterns shapes the understanding of relationships, highlighting the difference between genuine care and self-compromise. By observing what is and responding with wisdom, one maintains equilibrium, cultivates clarity, and exercises reasoned judgment. This is the path of discernment: to tolerate only what aligns with virtue, to act decisively when patterns persist unaltered, and to honor both self and other through conscious, principled engagement. In doing so, the mind strengthens, the heart steadies, and the life lived is consistent with reason, integrity, and enduring purpose. Influence is often mistaken for authority, a subtle illusion that convinces us we can steer someone else's growth, shape their character, or direct the course of their development. It is tempting to believe that by guiding, instructing, or correcting, we can ensure progress or transformation. Yet true transformation arises from within. It is a choice made in alignment with internal recognition, reflection, and commitment, not a response to external pressure or insistence. Stoicism teaches that our domain of authority is limited to our own judgments, our own actions, and the cultivation of our own character. Attempting to extend control beyond this is an expenditure of energy with uncertain returns, often at the cost of clarity and emotional equilibrium. Understanding the distinction between influence and authority is foundational to navigating relationships with wisdom and composure. The desire to influence often stems from care, attachment, or concern, yet it can blur into subtle control when not tempered by reflection. Acting from genuine care entails offering support, encouragement, and guidance when requested or appropriate, rather than imposing change according to personal expectations. Attempting to compel transformation risks imposing our own timeline, ideals, and anxieties upon another, subtly prioritizing our comfort over their autonomy. By observing this tendency, one begins to differentiate between support rooted in compassion and intervention motivated by desire for predictability or emotional security. Recognizing this distinction is the first step toward engaging with integrity while maintaining boundaries. Transformation is never instantaneous. It is a gradual emergence, a process shaped by internal readiness and willingness. Forcing change, however well-intentioned, rarely yields lasting results. Instead, it generates resistance, resentment, or dependence, undermining the very qualities it seeks to cultivate. The choice to grow lies with the individual, and no external intervention can substitute for the alignment of internal recognition, motivation, and intention. Influence functions as a subtle guidance, a model, and a supportive environment, but the decision and effort remain the responsibility of the individual. Offering a conducive environment for growth requires patience, observation, and restraint. The Stoic recognizes that the energy spent managing outcomes outside one's control is better allocated to one's own character, decisions, and judgments. Positive influence can take many forms: modeling integrity, demonstrating discipline, offering insight, or creating conditions in which choices align with virtue. These efforts, however, do not guarantee transformation. They merely present possibilities for the individual to engage with consciously. The distinction between presenting opportunity and imposing action is subtle but profound, determining whether engagement fosters autonomy or dependency. The temptation to intervene often arises when we perceive potential that is unrealized, when we imagine the person as they could be rather than as they are. Carl Jung observed that projection of our own desires and expectations onto others can distort perception, creating an illusion of authority over outcomes that does not exist. When we attempt to enact change based on these projections, we inadvertently prioritize our own need for control over the actual growth of the individual. The Stoic path emphasizes clarity of perception, seeing people as they are, not as we wish them to be, and recognizing that their choices, efforts, and alignment with values cannot be substituted by external will. The responsibility, then, is to maintain one's own integrity. By focusing on internal consistency, moral alignment, and clarity of judgment, we preserve agency and composure. Our role is not to dictate trajectories, but to embody the qualities we value, to cultivate stability and virtue in ourselves, and to create environments that support growth without attempting to manipulate or coerce. Epictetus reminded that serenity arises when we accept the limits of what we can control and act within those limits with reason. Attempting to control the choices of others is a surrender of personal equilibrium. Observing boundaries, offering support, and honoring autonomy preserves both integrity and tranquility. Recognizing the freedom of self-determination in others also reframes attachment and expectation. We may hope for change, envision growth, or desire alignment, yet these hopes must be tempered by understanding that transformation is voluntary. Patience and equanimity become essential, as does the awareness that the pace, timing, and direction of another's development are not ours to command. By internalizing this principle, we learn to invest energy in what is meaningful and effective, rather than attempting to orchestrate outcomes beyond our domain. The exercise of influence without control is subtle, demanding reflection, restraint, and wisdom. It involves cultivating an environment conducive to virtue, offering insight when invited, and demonstrating qualities worthy of emulation. But it requires surrender of the desire to direct or guarantee transformation. Aristotle observed that guidance is effective only when met with readiness and willingness. Effort imposed externally cannot substitute for internal commitment. The Stoic embraces this understanding, recognizing that attempts to compel are less effective than example, patience, and thoughtful support. By attending to this distinction, one preserves peace of mind, nurtures relationships ethically, and allows genuine growth to emerge organically. Ultimately, the recognition that influence is not authority empowers clarity, discernment, and integrity. It clarifies the boundary between support and control, between engagement and imposition, and between hope and reality. By observing this distinction, one acts intentionally, maintains internal equilibrium, and respects the autonomy of others. Choices regarding interaction, support, and presence are guided by reason rather than impulse, allowing relationships to develop in alignment with reality rather than expectation. The Stoic path emphasizes that freedom and virtue reside in the cultivation of one's own mind, judgment, and conduct, and that external transformation occurs only when it arises from within, not from coercion or pressure. The hidden costs of staying often go unnoticed until they have quietly reshaped the contours of your inner life. Fear of solitude exerts a subtle pressure, whispering that being alone is unbearable, that comfort is found only in the presence of another, even when that presence erodes clarity and stability. Hope for change can be equally binding, creating a mental rehearsal of potential outcomes that may never materialize. Emotional dependency, a tether forged from repeated reassurance and intermittent validation, pulls insistently, masking itself as connection, but often functioning as a chain that limits autonomy. Each of these forces, individually or combined, creates a landscape in which endurance is mistaken for virtue, patience is mistaken for wisdom, and attachment is mistaken for love. Yet these costs are real, measurable not in dramatic moments, but in the slow depletion of energy, focus, and self-respect that occurs over months or years of tolerating inconsistency, neglect, or misalignment. Consider the subtle ways attachment manifests. It can appear as justification, rationalizing repeated disappointments in the name of loyalty or potential. It may show as procrastination of difficult decisions, delaying boundaries or disengagement because the mental discomfort seems more immediate than the long-term cost. Hope often disguises itself as optimism, convincing the mind that the patterns witnessed are temporary or that latent potential will eventually emerge. Stoic philosophy reminds us that virtue and peace are cultivated not by clinging to illusions, but by aligning perception and action with reality. When tolerance is motivated by fear or expectation rather than reasoned choice, it becomes an erosion of agency, a surrender of the very faculties that define character. Recognizing this subtle erosion is a prerequisite for informed action. The illusion of potential can be seductive, particularly when the mind projects idealized qualities onto another person. Carl Jung noted that people frequently live in a space between reality and unconscious projection, filling gaps in perception with imagined traits or capacities that serve internal needs rather than reflecting the actual behaviors of others. When the mind is invested in this illusion, it allows endurance to persist, justifying repeated compromises as necessary steps toward eventual alignment. Each tolerated deviation, each overlooked pattern accumulates, creating a cognitive and emotional debt that undermines clarity. The danger is not merely in misplaced hope, but in the silent diminishment of discernment and self-respect. Awareness of this process is the first step toward reclaiming agency, observing patterns objectively, and assessing alignment between lived reality and personal values. Attachment rooted in fear or expectation often results in the depletion of energy. Time, emotional bandwidth, and cognitive resources are expended in attempts to maintain equilibrium with circumstances beyond one's control. The mind rehearses dialogues, anticipates outcomes, and mitigates conflict, all while preserving the illusion that influence or hope is sustaining positive change. This mental labor exacts a subtle but cumulative toll, draining capacity that could otherwise be devoted to deliberate growth, disciplined practice, and engagement with what is genuinely within one's control. By redirecting attention from external hope to internal mastery, one safeguards energy, clarity, and intentionality. Fear of solitude, while natural, often obscures the necessity of self-determined choice. The anxiety of being alone can generate tolerance of repeated harm, misalignment, or disappointment, creating a dynamic in which presence is prioritized over principle. Stoicism teaches that solitude is not inherently threatening. Rather, it is an opportunity to cultivate reason, self-discipline, and independence. By framing time alone as a space for reflection and deliberate action, the mind is strengthened and discernment becomes clearer. Decisions to remain or disengage are then evaluated through reasoned assessment rather than emotional compulsion. Courage emerges not from clinging, but from recognizing that endurance is optional, that clarity and peace are preserved through deliberate choice rather than habitual accommodation. Hope for change often blinds the mind to patterns that are persistent and unaltered. Each promise, each declaration of intention may temporarily reassure, yet without evidence in repeated action, it is an unreliable metric of future alignment. Seneca emphasized that expectation detached from observation creates suffering, while judgment rooted in reality cultivates freedom and wisdom. By observing actions over promises, one discerns whether persistence in a relationship maintains integrity or compromises it. The courage to leave when necessary is not a mark of defeat, but an act of reasoned alignment with truth. It affirms the value of internal equilibrium, preserves agency, and honors the boundaries that maintain clarity and virtue. Emotional dependency can quietly anchor the mind to circumstances that compromise well-being. The desire for reassurance, validation, or affirmation from another often encourages the mind to ignore red flags, tolerate repeated misalignment, and rationalize behaviors that erode stability. This dependency can make disengagement feel impossible, obscuring the recognition that true power lies in governing one's own responses rather than attempting to govern outcomes beyond control. By observing attachment with discernment, the mind distinguishes between necessity and compulsion, between reasoned endurance and the erosion of principle. Ultimately, the recognition of these hidden costs clarifies the necessity of action. Wisdom involves identifying what is within control and releasing what is not. Leaving when circumstances persistently compromise clarity, energy, or self-respect is not surrender. It is deliberate engagement with reality. It is an exercise in courage, in self-mastery, and in alignment with principle. By acknowledging the subtle yet significant costs of attachment, by evaluating endurance through the lens of observation rather than hope, and by choosing action consistent with reason, The mind preserves integrity, cultivates agency, and honors the values that define a life of purpose and equanimity. In doing so, leaving becomes a choice guided by reason and virtue, an affirmation of self-responsibility, and a demonstration of courage in the face of patterns that cannot be altered externally. Discernment is the quiet, steady work of the mind, a practice often overlooked in the rush of emotion, hope, and expectation. It begins with observation, noticing what persists and what shifts, understanding the subtle rhythms that define behavior over time. To step back without judgment is to create the mental space necessary for clarity, to view patterns as they truly exist, rather than as you wish them to be. This requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to confront truths that may be uncomfortable. The ability to measure what is tolerable, to recognize the boundaries that preserve equilibrium, and to distinguish between what is essential and what is merely desirable is a skill cultivated through reflection and conscious attention. It is in these ordinary, unremarkable moments that wisdom accrues, revealing the difference between attachment to illusion and alignment with reality. The practice of discernment is inseparable from evaluation of priorities. In every interaction, relationship, and engagement, there exists a tension between what nourishes your sense of self and what merely entertains or distracts. Preferences, comfort, convenience, charm, or fleeting gratification often seduce the mind into tolerating behaviors that are inconsistent with values or well-being. Priorities, by contrast, are non-negotiable. They are the principles, boundaries, and standards that sustain integrity and cultivate clarity. Recognizing this distinction allows for decisions grounded in reason rather than impulse. The Stoic perspective emphasizes that life's challenges are best navigated when choices are informed by observation, discernment, and an unwavering commitment to what is genuinely necessary for personal flourishing. Life unfolds in seasons, and relationships are not exempt from this truth. People grow, evolve, or retreat in ways that may surprise, delight, or disappoint. Stoicism teaches that external circumstances are indifferent, that attachment to outcomes is a source of suffering, and that equanimity arises from measured judgment rather than emotional reactivity. When observing persistent patterns, it becomes clear that no amount of hope, persuasion, or intervention can compel change that is not internally motivated. Acceptance of this reality is not resignation, but a conscious acknowledgement of what is within your control and what is not. The discernment to recognize these limits is a foundation of freedom, allowing the mind to act with intention, courage, and clarity. Attachment to potential can obscure judgment. We may invest in relationships or connections with the expectation that someone will become what we imagine, projecting our ideals onto behaviors that are inconsistent or incomplete. When discernment is lacking, we mistake hope for evidence, desire for alignment, and imagination for reality. By cultivating careful observation and conscious evaluation, the mind distinguishes between what can be relied upon and what exists only in the realm of aspiration. This clarity allows decisions to be informed by truth rather than longing, preserving both peace and integrity. The act of releasing when necessary is an exercise in mastery rather than capitulation. To let go with compassion is to recognize the limitations of influence, the autonomy of others, and the importance of preserving personal equilibrium. It is not bitterness, nor is it punitive. Rather, it is the practical application of reasoned judgment, a deliberate choice to align action with principle. By releasing what is beyond influence while maintaining respect and care, the individual exercises discernment and self-mastery simultaneously. The act of letting go becomes a conscious assertion of values rather than an emotional reaction. Discernment also requires the courage to confront discomfort. It is rarely easy to disengage from patterns that are familiar, even when they are detrimental. Fear of solitude, of regret, or of emotional loss can obscure clarity. Yet wisdom lies in recognizing that such fears are transient, whereas compromise of principle has lasting consequences. Seneca advised that the avoidance of short-term discomfort should not compromise enduring virtue. By observing patterns without attachment, by weighing priorities over preferences, and by evaluating the true costs of continued engagement, the mind cultivates the strength necessary to act decisively and in accordance with reason. Courage in this context is a product of reflection, awareness, and alignment with personal integrity. Equanimity in action is a natural extension of discernment. When the mind sees clearly that repeated behaviors will not change, Stoic practice encourages response with composure rather than reaction. Detachment is exercised with care, presence is maintained without compromise, and decisions are enacted with intentionality. This balance preserves inner peace while maintaining ethical engagement with others. Recognizing this truth allows for navigation of relationships with clarity, patience, and respect, ensuring that choices are guided by reason rather than emotional impulse. Ultimately, the power of discernment shapes the quality of engagement with life itself. By distinguishing between what is essential and what is secondary, by observing patterns without judgment, and by choosing action aligned with principle, one cultivates freedom, integrity, and self-respect. To release a connection that undermines well-being is not a failure. It is a demonstration of wisdom, courage, and mastery over desire and attachment. The Stoic teaches that clarity and composure are achieved not by clinging to illusion, but by observing reality with honesty and responding accordingly. To leave when it serves the soul is the ultimate exercise of discernment, the culmination of reasoned judgment, and an affirmation of the values that define a life lived with intentionality, presence, and integrity. Remember this: your peace, your clarity, and your integrity are yours to protect. Letting go when it serves your soul is not weakness, it is courage. It is the quiet mastery of the mind, the calm power of reason over attachment, the strength to honor yourself above all else. Every choice you make to act with wisdom shapes the life you deserve, grounded in reality, guided by virtue, and aligned with your own values. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal, for walking this path of reflection, discernment, and self-mastery. If these ideas resonated, I invite you to continue your journey. Watch one of the videos on the screen now to deepen your understanding and strengthen your practice of Stoicism.